So my policy is, and always has been, that if I have an interest in a thing, if I have a hobby or something that catches my interest, that there's got to be a book about it. One of the things that I enjoy is the family and I have been on trips to New York City, and that's a place that I enjoy. So of course, then I need to find books about it. A few months ago, I finished this book. It's called 20 Minutes in Manhattan by Michael Sorkin, and he's an architect that lives in Manhattan and works in Manhattan, and he has a 20-minute commute to his office. And this is about some of the history or rationale or functioning behind the things that he passes on his 20-minute walk in Manhattan. And it's a long story why this part exists, but in a chapter called The Stoop, see, he moves from his apartment out the front door to his workplace, and in a chapter early on called The Stoop, he talks about the way that stoops and people in New York work cooperatively. And while he's talking about that, he was talking about something in particular that got my attention, which I'm going to share with you now. It has to do with a wall in the city of New York that is about as old as I am. It blows my mind that it's not older than this, but it's about the same age as I am. It is called the Pooper Scooper Wall. And that's what I've brought all this up for, to talk to you about the Pooper Scooper Wall, which was enacted in 1978. It's actually called the Canine Waste Wall, but it's been known as the Pooper Scooper Wall. And so that was the idea that people who walk their dogs should pick up after them. And Sorkin's thing is that people basically, to a person, follow this rule pretty closely. And the neighborhoods self-regulate on this. If a person doesn't do it, the neighborhood sort of talks to them about it. And so cooperative living was part of this chapter. But the part that got my attention is that the law was challenged for its constitutionality sometime shortly after it was established. Orthodox Jewish plaintiffs claimed that it violated their freedom of religion because they were forbidden from picking up litter on the Sabbath. So basically there was a lawsuit by Orthodox Jews who said that they should not have to clean up after their dogs on the Sabbath because that constituted picking up litter and that broke the Sabbath laws for them. And so the way that the court found was that indeed they still had to clean up after their dogs even if they were after religious liberty. I guess thank goodness for that. And in the motion that was filed, or the results of that, the plaintiff's theory is that a religious individual may litter on the Sabbath, but cannot be compelled to pick up his litter. If it is permissible to walk one's dog on the Sabbath, it is permissible not to defile the streets. Works of necessity are permitted, and since cleanliness is next to godliness, it is doubtful whether an all-seeing and benevolent deity would approve the desecration of public places in the name of orthodoxy. And so the Pooper Scooper Wall stands. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to a somewhat special edition of Preparing for Sunday, where you and I take a look together at the upcoming Sunday's lectionary scripture text. This is special because, as you can tell, I am not recording this in my normal location. I'm a little out of sorts, but will be with you this upcoming Sunday, where we will gather around this text. This is the second week after Pentecost, year B. Yay, year B. Selectionary is 3 years, A, B, and C. Yay, year B, because we're finally going to get into a long stretch of the Gospel of Mark, which is the Gospel assigned mostly to year B. And I love that because Mark is my favorite Gospel. I am unabashed in that. And so now we get a long stretch where I will be talking to you about the Gospel of Mark. This upcoming Sunday's text is Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through Mark 3, verse 6. And before we get too far here, error alert, error alert, error alert. This doesn't have anything to do with the pooper scooper law, but there is an error within the text. So if you're a pauser and you pause and read the text, Mark 2:23 through 3:6, let's see if you can test your biblical knowledge here and find that error. All right, you have it. The error is that the name that Jesus says is the high priest in the time of David, Ahimelech, is incorrect. Ahimelech was not the high priest at the time of David. It was Abiathar, and so either Jesus, unlikely, or Mark, more likely, got this wrong. One of the questions that we may want to ask ourselves as people of faith is, why do we need 4 accounts in the Gospels or in the Bible of Gospels? Why do we need 4 of these? One answer might be because Mark, which was the first one written, needed cleaned up by the others. They also add some color and some context that Mark doesn't have. The reason why I love Mark, though, is because not only is it the first gospel written, it's the first sort of biography or way of being a theological biography in the history of the world. We now read those books all the time. We've been reading one together in the last few weeks of Bonhoeffer. This is the creation of Mark himself. Before, to the best of our knowledge, that did not exist. This focus on Jesus and his theology. But it does have some rough Greek, and it has some mistakes in it, and I just talked to you about one. So inside the text itself, the reason why I started by talking to you about the pooper scooper law, besides being a fun law to talk about, right? It's fun to talk about pooper scooping. Poopy scoopy? I don't know, whatever. It's fun to talk to you about being a pooper scooper. Besides that, I wanted to bring the emphasis onto the Sabbath. Why does Jesus do what he does on the Sabbath? I've said this in various preparings, in various sermons, in various conversations. This is an important sort of, or interesting, I'll say, at least to myself, question that we apply to the Gospels. If Jesus is doing things on the Sabbath that the Pharisees don't like, sometimes even healing on the Sabbath, let's take a healing. If Jesus is going to heal on the Sabbath, and sometimes it'll be a person who is blind from birth, the text will tell us. Why on the Sabbath? Why didn't he just wait a day, heal the person, and keep himself out of trouble? There's something particularly important that he's trying to make out of doing this on the Sabbath. He's going out of his way to do this on the Sabbath. That is something that sort of applies to this pooper scooper thing, that there's some specialness to the Sabbath. That, of course, has to do with the 10 Commandments, which are at the heart of our faith as Lutherans. But it also has to do with why Jesus gets in trouble. But this Sabbath piece is important. And so for me, that's the emphasis here. The Sermon Sunday will talk about, will hit on the Sabbath. And you're going to say, oh, I already know all about the Sabbath. But what I want to talk to you about is why the humankind is gifted the Sabbath by God. And so God is always creating. God is always advancing. God is always bringing God's kingdom. So that happens when Jesus comes. That happens when Jesus addresses the Sabbath. That happens when Mark writes his gospel. That happens when we go on with life and when we have things like a pooper scooper law that then Jewish folks have to feel out. Hey, how does this fit into our understanding of the Sabbath? God is always answering that in new circumstances. But we cannot and should not get away from the heart of what the Sabbath is. And this moves in a very countercultural, counter-Western culture way. And so we need reminded of it because we're bombarded with the opposite so often that you and I lose track of what the Sabbath is. And that's something that, to me, the Pharisees or the people of Jesus' day may have lost track of too. Maybe those folks in New York City who want to basically have permission to let their dogs poop on the sidewalk have lost track of what the Sabbath is too. It's not simply rules for rules' sake. It isn't pro forma, which is what this text is talking about. This is not a thing that we do, just to jump through a hoop, just to look separate, just to look holy. This is something God does in our midst to save us. If you know long days, or depression, or sadness, or grief, and or look at the news and wonder what's going on, if you look at the world and have questions for it, Sabbath is God's, or one of, but a primary answer that God makes. And it moves so contra what we think that it's important to sit in it. We do that again because Mark 2 and early here in chapter 3 bring this up again. And to talk about that, I'm going to have to go with you back some pages from Mark, a lot of pages, and back in time. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to land in the 5th chapter of Exodus. And I have a particular reason for landing here. During this time, the Israelites are in captivity in Egypt. And so the Israelites have, sort of over time fallen into really slavery in Egypt. They went there sort of to visit in the face of a famine, and then they sort of slowly became the not powerful place. Well, that wasn't slow, but then taken advantage of. They're now slaves in Egypt. And in chapter 5, we get a flavor of what that slavery is all about. Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh, and they're talking about letting their people go. And Pharaoh will not let the people go. And he says to them, why are you taking people away from their work? Get to your labors. They cannot stop working. I need more bricks. This is repeatedly here in chapter 5. Pharaoh talking to the taskmaster, their supervisors. You have to make more bricks, and instead of us even helping the supply chain and the production, they're going to have to make the bricks, even and get the supplies they need to make the bricks, and still make more. It's this production. It's this calculable worth. It's this power wanting more. And we get a sense of that in Egypt in chapter 5. And this is what Yahweh frees God's people from. What we're being freed from, or what we're talking about here, is that God is not a workaholic. God is not a consumer. Now, it's important that I put a really need to be heard converse here. Martin Luther, for example, many years after this Exodus, but still before us, is going to talk about our vocations, and that God gives us gifts, and the way that we get to live into the redemption of Christ, into the death and even the resurrection of Christ, is through our vocation. If you're called today to be retired by a grandma or a neighbor, if you're not retired and you're headed to work, that vocation, school, the thing we do is the place where we live. And so that remains important. The Sabbath is a reminder of how to live where we live, and how to be who we are, and how to live into our vocation. And so what I mean when I say God is not a workaholic is that God is going to not only ask for freedom from the machine of making, and you can see that in Exodus 5. Yahweh is actually going to set a day on the calendar where you don't do anything at all. And so what God is saying is that our life is for life, if that makes sense. And that sounds kind of new agey. God created us and brings God's kingdom, and God frees us in Christ to be who we are. If you've ever heard the Luther famous thing, sin boldly, that doesn't mean go out and punch people or gamble away everything or drink or do all sorts of weird stuff. What he's talking about is live in confidence that you are who God made you, and if that means some sin or some mistakes, God knows that you're set where you are, and that's why there's confession and forgiveness. That doesn't mean we don't love our neighbor. That doesn't mean we don't go out of our way. That doesn't poop on the sidewalks. It means that we stop producing for production's sake. I think we get caught up in a cycle of what we can accomplish, and we are our accomplishments for the day. I think sometimes you see in people who are retired, especially maybe post-COVID, you see people who are now removed from the supply chain or production who are almost lost, or too only, because they don't have a sort of metric to measure what they're producing for a culture. God is saying you still have a vocation. We're not workaholics. We aren't created for work. Work is part of where we live out our purpose. And that'll fit that piece there about humankind is not made for the Sabbath. Sabbath is made for humankind, which is found there in Mark 2, 3 through 6. And so what we're thinking about here is the way that God redeems. And the way that God redeems often moves counterintuitively, counterculturally, especially from the West and from a sort of capitalistic place. I'm reading a book, or talking to you about a book about a guy who's going to work, and he's an architect, and that's about money, and that's about power. But if you're not careful, you're a cog in a machine, and you're a cog in a machine that you may not even appreciate what the machine is doing. This is talking more about an appreciation and engagement with his walk, with his neighborhood, with who he is. And that maybe sort of picks up what a Sabbath is. On the Sabbath, and this is becoming increasingly not sought after, we take time out. And so we don't know what to do with time out. We think we won't rest, but often the reason why we rest is we think it's so we can recharge our batteries to work harder. That is not really the concept of the Sabbath. It isn't a metric like, hey, if I take one day off, that means my production will go up the other days. It's not talking about production at all. It's talking about God's voice and really being our identity, and then that being the place where our success or our part of God's kingdom coming, our living out our vocation comes out of. And it's not really a metric. One of the things that makes Yahweh sort of hard for the other people in the world of the Bible, even for the Jewish people at times, is that it's not a metric. It's not a do A, get B, do C, get D kind of easy thing. So what we have here is a reminder of what the Sabbath is. And we get this in Christ, and he comes to redeem us and deliberately addresses the Sabbath because it's so blatantly misused. Why on the Sabbath? Because the Sabbath was God's gift to humanity, to you and I, and it's so easily lost. And by being lost, we so easily lose ourselves. And so here in Mark, we get Jesus' work on the Sabbath. It gets him in trouble. It leads to a death and a resurrection. Mark is painting that story. It's important for us to know that it leads to a death and then puts ourselves in God's hands for a resurrection. It's a death in our world to be about something other than a metric. And I am not saying, hey, don't produce good grades on tests, don't produce the widgets at work that you're supposed to, I'm not saying that so much as that comes as a secondary part of how we live out who we are. Does the grade you get become a vocation that comes from the identity God reminds us of in the Sabbath? This is commanded, that we observe the Sabbath. Why is it commanded? Because otherwise we will be too busy and not good at doing it otherwise. We will lose ourselves, we will lose our identity. We will take people to court over whether we have to pick up poop on the Sabbath or not. This is what it'll devolve into. And so the Sabbath is a reestablishment of God's presence for us. It's God's work in our lives. And the truth is that almost none of us are great at this, and so that's why I'm emphasizing that part of this reading in preparing. The sermon is going to be all about it. And here's the thing about that. It's funny that we'll gather on our Sabbath. We will be present. We will be tuned into the stream or whatever. And then I'll be saying, hey, do this better in some ways. And then I'll saying why or what it looks like to do this better. I think that the better that we are with the Sabbath, and then the better we are able to speak about and talk to other people about it, the more God's kingdom comes. So what I want to focus on with you is that God is not a workaholic. Yahweh, God, is not a metric, and that the Sabbath is made for us to for God to find us and for God to do God's work. And if we want to have meaning and vocation and sin boldly and in this confidence, the Sabbath starts it. It isn't an also into a calendar. It's a beginning. And so it moves contrary to Pharaoh and Egypt and whatever workplace and metric weighs so heavily on us. And we want to know why our world feels lost. Maybe that's because we've lost the Sabbath, and not just lost it like, hey, we're good at recreation. That's not what the Sabbath is per se. Recreation is some of it. It is a sort of restfulness for our bodies, but it is also a meditative openness to God's Spirit, and so that's what we do for preparing. We're sort of trying to be Sabbath people, and that is what we will do when we gather again this upcoming Sunday, or we'll think about it. I think the Sabbath is a thing that we need. I think it rectifies, heals, redeems us, and I think it is a thing that God works in us, and then is a voice that our world needs. It requires dying to what we think is the right way to function, metrics and rules and engagement and what to accomplish, and then it requires being reminded again of something that we think is too simple. That our identity is in God, not in our metrics. We think that's too simple, but we sit and we let God speak to us, and God raises us. We die to this world and we're raised again in Christ to enter into the world in a way that brings peace and hope to us and to others, and that is God's work. And it is work that really moves on the fulcrum of the Sabbath. So thanks for joining me again for preparing for Sunday. I invite you to look at Mark 2, 23 through 36. Think of, pray about what you hope for in a Sabbath and what you think God does in it. Take a look at Exodus 5, where we get a pretty clear idea outlining of the system God is trying to free us from in the Sabbath. And then